Hey, and welcome to the 11th session of the Mula Madhyamaka Reading Group. And today we'll discuss chapter 18, which is an analysis of the self. I get to it. Okay, cool. So like some of the other chapters, I think it's good to just start straight from the commentary that's provided as an overall summary of what we're reading for the chapter. So I'll just take this section from the first page of the chapter. Buddhists all agree that there is nothing in reality that is the basis of our sense of I and mine. They agree that it's our mistaken belief in the existence of something behind the sense of I and mine that brings about suffering. So they should all agree that reality is characterized by the absence of self. The question is, what is this reality that falsely appears as if it included a self? For Abhidharma, the answer is that reality is just the impermanent, impersonal dharmas. Abhidharma holds that there must be such a reality on which the false belief in I and mind is superimposed. Madhyamaka agrees that belief in I and mind is false, but Madhyamaka disputes the claim that there must be dharmas, things with intrinsic nature, underlying this false belief. So basically the gist of this whole chapter is that there's a sense in which Nāgārjuna is aligned with the Abhidharmikas in the sense that they're both committed to the idea that the I and mind is a superimposition, it's a false reality. And they both advocate for intimation with emptiness as a way to overcome this tendency for I and mind. But I think, based on the Madhyamaka understanding of what emptiness entails, the Madhyamaka critique of the Abhidharmika view is sort of along the sense that the Abhidharmika view of emptiness does not go deep enough because it only stays with the emptiness of the person, leaving intact the emptiness of the basis of the person, which is the dharmas. And Madhyamaka will also negate the reality of dharmas as well. So we can go straight to the first verse. If the self were the skandhas, it would participate in coming to be and passing away. If it were something other than the skandhas, it would be something having the defining characteristic of a non-skandha. So here we have this interesting setup of the relationship between the self and the aggregates, which are appropriated by the self. And we're asking this question, are they identical to each other or distinct? And the verse basically negates either possibility. And this sort of the implicit reasoning that I got from the commentary is that the self is not identical to the skandhas because that would imply, for example, that the self is fragmented and momentary, just like the skandhas are fragmented and momentary. But this sort of does not really represent or sort of is consistent with our actual innate sense of self, which is to understand ourselves as a continuous unity that's unchanging. Another implication that might be unacceptable is the idea that there are multiple selves, that there are as many selves as there are many aggregates, but then that sort of just multiplies the amount of things we have to account for. So it doesn't really account for it. So because of those reasonings, the idea that the self is identical to the skandhas is refuted. The idea that the self is distinct from the skandhas is also refuted because the idea is that when you go and look for the self, you only ever find the skandhas, what's being appropriated. If you find anything at all. So you can't actually find a self that's distinct from the skandhas. That you can say is different from them. So that's also refuted. Do you, any of you have any more comments on that first verse?
Yeah, I think a useful way to think about this chapter might be in terms of like different properties or things we like things that we intuitively take to be parts of ourself. And there are different like lists among like in texts and among philosophers and stuff about what sort of intuitively, if we wanted to have a concept of selfhood that aligned with our intuitive concept of selfhood, what it would have to entail. And I like Jan Westerhoff's list for this, which is he says there are 5 things that are part of the intuitive concept of self. That it's substantial and self-sustaining. So whereas like other psychological entities can't stand on their own because like emotions have to be had by someone, or like, you know, thoughts have to be had by a thinker. The self isn't had by anything else. It's the thing that has the other things. So it's substantial. It's unified. It's not made of different parts. It's a single entity. It's temporally extended. It exists and remains the same for as long as we exist. It is the agent. It's the thing that acts when we act and is the one that's responsible for the actions we set in motion. And it's the primary object of prudential concern. So it's when we make decisions about the future or like plan to avoid risks and stuff, we are doing that for the sake of the self. And so these are the 5, I guess, parts of the intuitive concept of self. Or at least I think that's a useful way to think about the intuitive concept of self. And so then what this first argument is, I guess, showing, if the self were the skandhas, then we wouldn't meet the intuitive requirement of temporal extension, as the commentary says, because since they come into and go out of existence many times over the course of a single life, and likewise over the course of rebirth, you would have many selves over time instead of having one that's temporally extended. So that like fails to meet with the temporal extension criteria, I guess. And if you, I guess, look at all of these different things that the self could be and find that none of them meet the intuitive conception, then the way, I guess, that the Buddhist would say, of course, is that that points to the intuition being wrong, or that there is no such thing that aligns with the intuitive conception.
Yeah, really great points. Something, or you know, if any other conception is brought up, it starts to become like a philosophical idea that just starts to diverge from the intuitive experience, which is a real thing we're trying to actually investigate. And one of the interesting things is that this intuitive sense of self and this very useful list of 5 characteristics of this seems to basically mirror the object of negation, the object to be refuted by Madhyamaka analysis. And it seems to be like this perspective is like an interesting way to, I don't know, like somehow resolve this possible issue I had in the past, thinking about, well, you know, if there's no true existence, then how can we know what it is to refute it in the first place? And in this sense, we do kind of know what it is in the sense that it's our sense of what it is, but it's not really a knowledge of something. More so, it's kind of an assumption of knowledge of something. So we
that I phrase, I've had the exact same thought, and the way that I've phrased it is, what you refute with the analysis is the seeming of something, finding that what seemed like it was the case isn't the case. And then I guess then the further Madhyamaka insight, because of I mean, even Abhidharmakas do that with the sense of self. They find that the seeming thing, but then they don't do the same thing to the dharmas themselves. And then the extra Madhyamaka step is to say, even the seeming to the Abhidharmaka philosopher of there being a truly existent causal sequence of dharmas is also just a seeming. It seems to be the case, but it isn't really.
The distinction between the seeming of the Abhidharmikas and the seeming of the Madhyamikas seems to be like that the Abhidharmikas sort of look at the object, you know, to be refuted and sort of look past it towards something else that they can see. So it's kind of like referenced against something. Yeah. Whereas the Madhyamaka sort of just sees kind of like, I think the Yogacara position, that the thing being seen is just kind of a projection. It itself is what's being seen, and not something like past it.
Yeah, or they see past it at something that is also just seeming to be seen
Right.
past, going on forever and ever. There's a really
Exactly.
good quote, I think it's from the third Karmapa in his commentary on Chandakirti's Madhyamakavatara. It's really, really amazing. It's very beautiful and also cool. Hold on. Here it is. Okay. Sorry, I just okay. Things are empty of, yeah, it's from the 8th Karmapa's commentary on Chandakirti's Madhyamakavatara. Things are empty of any inherent nature, such as reflections, illusions, and so forth, are commonly known to arise and be perceived due to the coming together of causes and conditions, like a mirror and a face, or a pebble, or a piece of wood and a magic spell, and so forth. The result that is itself not real, the mere semblance of a result, is posited in dependence upon causes and conditions. However, the causes and conditions themselves are not real either. Just as in this case, in the example of the mirror and the face, cause and result do not inherently exist because their relationship is like that of emanations manifesting from emanations. So it's like you see this thing and you see past it because it's just a projection at the thing projecting it, which is also a projection. It's emanations of emanations. That this phrase of his, emanations of emanations, is what I really like. In
Yeah, actually seems to parallel something in the end of the previous chapter in the Madhyamaka on action and fruit, where, yeah, I'm just going to actually read verse 31 and 32, just a little backtrack. Just as a teacher by his supernatural power fabricates a magical being that in turn fabricates yet another magical being, so with regard to the agent, which has the form of a magical being and the action that is done by it, it is like the case where a second magical being is fabricated by a magical being. Yeah, so you kind of have this this like non-ontology of magical illusions all the way down. Basically, it's interesting. Cool. So we can move on to verse number 2. The self not existing, how will there be what belongs to the self? There is no mine and no I because of the cessation of self and that which pertains to the self. So here we're sort of off the bat assuming the implication of the first verse, which is that if the self is not identical or distinct from the skandhas, then we can't actually say it exists. And this, I think, is an interesting example of how Madhyamaka reasoning doesn't contradict the law of the excluded middle, because if there was an option outside of identity or distinctness, those two binary oppositions, then the force of the Madhyamaka argument would be diminished. It's the fact that there's only, sort of a thesis and this counter, that the self is identical or not. And once you refute both of those, then you really have no place to posit anything else. Maybe let's say you go on and posit some tetralemical combination, so like both identical or distinct, or neither identical nor distinct. But in my understanding often is that the third and fourth lemmas of the tetralemma tend to be sort of elaborations, sort of sophisticated versions of the first two lemmas. So, if you refute identity and distinctness, it doesn't make sense how you can just like say you have both, because you've already negated the other two. And with the fourth lemma, neither identical nor distinct, to an extent, that's also sort of superfluous, because if you refuted both of them, there's nothing to subsequently negate again. But of course, the tendency towards conceptual proliferation is to wiggle your way out of Madhyamaka reasoning as much as possible. So sometimes the third and fourth lemmas are things to be negated as well. Yeah, that was a bit of a divergence.
Does make me want. I mean, I don't really know where I'm going with this, but it does make me think about the. I don't know if people are familiar with the Jain sevenfold, whatever it's called, Jain let me think. It's the
The logical, I know what you're talking about.
the Saptabhangi, whatever it was,
The
Saptabhangi.
7 valued logic.
Yeah, which goes like to other places. Yeah, like I quite like it. I don't know much about it, but it's like it's always like in some ways it is, and in some ways it is not, and in some ways it is, in some ways it is not, and in some ways it is indescribable and stuff like this, which is
Yeah.
interesting. I don't know. I never read a scripture where they just outright had a clash. You know what I mean? Where like they were like, no, this doesn't work for these reasons or whatever. It's always like, well, you know. Anyway, it just makes me think of that as you say that, Kazi. I don't know how those fit, but
No, that's interesting because I think I really have not studied Jainism, so this is my complete straw man. But I feel like the sort of Madhyamaka concern about like sort of this idea of multi-perspectivalism, right? That multiple, seemingly even mutually contradicting perspectives can somehow be coordinated as different parts of a whole, sort of assumes that there is a common object of perception, a common object of analysis between multiple minds, and that sort of assumes inherent existence, right?
I mean, it does assume inherent existence because the conception of awakening there, you know, as in all, you know, non-Buddhist schools, is that the awakened being is one that perceives that which, you know, exists inherently perfectly or whatever, you know. So that is the kind of that is the position, isn't it? I think that is the position. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like maybe you can say that the analysis, you know, that the self is many, distinct from the skandhas, might be something that falls under the Jainist idea that there are multiple perspectives. But I don't know. I'm not going to say too much about Jainism because I am even less qualified to speak about that than how not qualified I am about Madhyamaka. But yeah, so verse 2, the self not existing, how will there be what belongs to the self? Okay, so here the key point to understand, I think, with the idea of the skandhas or the aggregates of the elements taken up by the self, is that they're defined as that which is appropriated by a self. That is the nature of the aggregates. So when there's no I in mind, when there is no self to do appropriating, so there's no self who's the appropriator. In the absence of the appropriator, there's no basis to posit the appropriated. Because if we say there are skandhas, then what we're saying is that there is a self that is taking up, or a seeming self that is taking up those skandhas. But if we have just refuted the self, then there's nothing there for to be appropriated. And let's see. Is there anything more to that? Oh, okay, so I kind of, jumbled up two different parts of this verse. But so the first verse is saying that because the self cannot be established, then the appropriated skandhas, what belongs to the self, cannot be established. And then that follows to, since there is no self, then there's no basis for I and mine, the sense of I and mine, which is the character of a self to have, which is to think of itself as I and its skandhas as mine. So verse 3, and who is without mine and I sense, he is not found. One who sees that which is without mind and I sense does not see. So I think this sort of, this falls from the last verse, which is that since a person is one who has a sense of I and mine, without the sense of I and mine, then you have no person. And the part about one who sees that which is without mind and I sense does not see. The way I see this is basically saying one who sees X does not see X, which is to say that there is a seeing on one level of X, but because X is not actually real, it's not really a true kind of seeing because there's nothing to be actually seen. So sort of a false view, which, so even if there is no, so there's a sort of subtle critique here or analysis here where it's not just that there's nothing to have a sense of I and mine. There's nothing there for you to say that there's a lack of a sense of I and mine, because there's no person for there to be to know that there's a lack of sense of I and mine.
I don't know enough Sanskrit to know about this last line of the third verse, and I might be totally wrong here. And I know I'm bringing in something from other kind of other places, but like there is this just because of the kind of scholars that some of the scholars that I've been reading and the things that I'm into, like this thing about one who sees that which is without mine and I sense does not see. Now I don't know the Sanskrit well enough to really know what other kinds of translations could be made of that, but like there is this I don't know what you would call it, this experience, perception, attainment, whatever, of like that in the Pali canon is called the cessation of perception and feeling. Yeah? So people talk about it a lot and equate it with like a direct seeing of emptiness as well. So apparently, so in those Theravadan scriptures towards the end of the Buddha's life, he's like abiding in emptiness in some of these suttas or whatever, and this is how he describes it. And he describes it as like, it's very sounds like, the unconditioned and all the rest of it. And well, they do talk about it there in many places as a sort of not seeing as well. But actually, like the actual experiences of fading, of perception and conception fading, like that's the sort of, obviously I don't know how to talk about this kind of thing, but so whenever they in these scriptures there's a thing about not seeing, the one who sees this does not see. I always think of that as well. I don't know if that is relevant.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's actually pretty insightful. Yeah, there's a cessation involved, right? In the sort of clear seeing that's implied by the not seeing, right? And in a sort of like the forcefulness of like the sort of Buddhist critique, yeah, is that like part of what it means to see falsely is to be using perception and conception, which are diluted by ignorance from the very beginning. Which entails that to see properly is to cease perception and conception to a significant degree, if not completely altogether. Yeah, and another way I sort of break down these two different senses of seeing is with the two truths. So the first sense is a conventional truth, and the second is the ultimate truth, or references the ultimate truth by referencing how the conventional truth excludes the ultimate truth, which is an interesting way of like approaching, seeing how Madhyamaka approaches this. It's indirectly through negation, right? So it's not saying that one who sees that which is without mind and eye sense, or does not see what is truly there or something. It's sort of just saying that the seeing which sees eye and mind does not see, So there's a subtle way of avoiding the sort of implicit substantialism that you might accidentally impose by saying that the false seeing is false with reference to a true seeing, and a true seeing of whatever that might be. For the Abhidharmikas, that's a true seeing of the impersonal dharmas. But of course, Madhyamaka will relegate that even to the sphere of seeing, which is not seeing. Cool. So yeah, we can just keep going a little faster because I know some of us are caught with time. No time.
Can I just say something about
yeah.
2 and 3?
Please.
I'm not sure if I'm reading too into this, but I actually thought what was going on here was an objection to the Madhyamaka was based on a sort of like semantic theory that the Madhyamaka would not agree with, in the idea that, like, to talk meaningfully about the fact that we mistakenly presuppose a self when there is none, is to actually assert that there is a self in some way. But the Madhyamaka, I don't think would argue that, would probably argue that we can meaningfully talk about things that don't actually exist, at least with Swabhava. It seems to me that's what the opponent was saying here, in order for, the Madhyamaka to even say that actually there is no self and no appropriation, is to sort of meaningfully posit that there are skandhas that where the I exists outside of.
Are you sort of referring to the explanation of verse 3 that sort of talks about how verse 3 is sort of is an implicit objection to or is an objection to an implicit like response?
Yeah, I think so. I think the objection is that the Madhyamaka needs to even posit like a sense of I, and they deposit skandhas and appropriation of a skandhas when they're really, the Madhyamaka wants to say that there really is no such thing.
Well, so the way I understand it is that the Madhyamaka doesn't actually need to posit any of that, but sort of takes it for granted as the material that's being refuted. So it sort of already assumes that we assume the existence of these things, and then sort of negates it that way. In that way, I think it's kind of like, we configure the Madhyamaka as an entirely relational endeavor, in the sense that it sort of depends on this sort of dialectic dialogue with existing ideas and conceptions, rather than sort of positively constructing a certain system first and then undermining it subsequently. I don't know, but that's sort of my response to
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the objection relies on like a way that language is used that the Madhyamaka would not agree with. Like, because like really what's going on, I think, is the Madhyamaka wants to point at like some kind of presupposition failure going on when we like point to things like the self and I, and they just want to say like, actually there's a mistaken presupposition here. It's not that we're negating the I. But it just makes me think, especially this verse in particular, makes me think of the kind of error theory that a Madhyamaka must have, in the sense that we can only be mistaken of things, whether that's like cognitively superimposing Swabhava onto things that don't have it, like the fallacy of reification, or in our language when we try to refer to things that don't actually have substantial existence. But we can only be in error when we mistakenly posit those things to exist that don't really exist in that way. Whereas like different error theories might differ on like what it means for like language not to refer to something. But I was just thinking like a Madhyamaka might need, like this verse in particular, like drew me into the idea that Madhyamaka might need an error theory from the other way as well, because like this is an error theory that might avoid something like the fallacy of eternalism, let's say. But what would an error theory look like for the Madhyamaka to avoid annihilationism? Because they would need an error theory from the other side as well. And I think whenever they try to posit an error theory from the other side, like they get pushback from the opponent. Like in verse 3 and 4 here, they're like, well, actually, don't you need to presuppose that there is such a thing as an I to even say, actually, this isn't the case? Maybe the graded teachings get around this issue. I'm not really sure, but anyway.
No, it's an interesting points you bring up. And which also made me think about how, the character of some of these objections, right? Which is funny to call them objections, because what they really are sort of immanent dialectical sort of oppositions within the text for the text to advance itself. though we generally also assume that they correspond to prevalent ideas at that time too. What was I saying? Oh, it's funny. It's interesting that a lot of these sort of objections tend to always sort of assume the very thing that is being negated in order to make the objection, right? So it's sort of like you said, it's like it's assuming that there are at least is a sense of a self or the aggregates for the Madhyamaka analysis to refute at all. And so, but that doesn't really apply, that kind of objection doesn't really apply to the Madhyamaka, because the Madhyamaka is sort of pointing out that these things never arisen in the first place to affirm or negate, to accept or reject. But yeah, maybe some of these concerns will be illuminated as we go forward. Okay, verse 4. The senses of mine and I, based on the outer and inner being lost, appropriation is extinguished. Because of losing that, there is a cessation of birth. So this is cool. I guess well, actually, I'll just read the very short commentary. This is the standard account of nirvana accepted by all Buddhists. One attains release from samsara by ridding oneself of all sense of I and mine. This leads to an end of appropriation of the skandhas, hence to the end to the processes responsible for rebirth. Outer is explained as whatever is thought of as distinct from the self, and is thus a potential object of appropriation. Inner is explained as whatever is taken as the core essence of the person. So now that we got to the point in our analysis where the sense of I and mine is negated, now we sort of get to the sort of point, the crux of the point at which the sort of chain of dependent origination, right? So in the serial scheme of the 12 nidanas, where ignorance leads to volitional karmic formations, at least a consciousness, name and form, the 6 ayatanas. I have a chart. I haven't memorized it well enough, which leads to contact, to feeling, to craving, then attachment, to then becoming and rebirth, which is all this cycle of suffering. And since principally it's understood that the sense of I and mine is just sort of the engine that drives the whole thing, once we refuted that, then the tendency towards appropriation is extinguished. And once we've lost that link in the series, the whole series unravels itself, because it's a mutually contained series, it's a network. This is an interesting point to also make about this sort of this scheme of dependent origination, is that we can understand it sort of serially or sort of diachronically, as like going from one phase to the next, as each phase sort of following from the preceding, but also functioning as conditions for the succeeding phases in the serial fashion, almost in a causal fashion. But we can also think of it all simultaneously or synchronically as sort of mutually implicated aspects of this sort of whole dynamic of suffering and ignorance. So even though there's a kind of, we can understand it in terms of a causal series, we should also understand that breaking any single link means the whole thing also unravels, because of the mutually contained structure that they have. So yeah, that was a bit of a tangent, but okay. Verse 5, liberation is attained through the destruction of actions and defilements. Actions and defilements arise because of falsifying conceptualizations. Those arise from hypostatization, but hypostatization is extinguished in emptiness. So here we can say that actions and defilements, deliberations and sort of dissonant affects are based in the automatic tendency to hypostatize. Which creates a kind of discordance with the way we think the world is and the way that it actually is, which produces this whole cycle of suffering. And that this tendency to hypostatize can only be truly exhausted through intimation with emptiness. And one of the interesting things about this verse is that you can kind of consider the Abhidharmikas as completely agreeing with what's sort of just flat out stated in this verse. However, subtly, implicitly, there is this idea that the mode of emptiness that we intimate ourselves with in order to exhaust hypostatization will be different between the Abhidharmikas and the Madhyamikas, whereas the Abhidharmika would, a sense of emptiness is that the mere absence of the person where there seems to be. For the Madhyamaka, it's even deeper, of course, piercing into all phenomenon. So we can understand that because the Madhyamaka understanding of emptiness is deeper and is sort of more encompassing, intimation with it is that much more forceful in its ability to soften and then eventually eliminate this tendency to hypostatize, which gives rise to actions and defilements and such. Let's see if there's anything else.
So I really like this verse number 5. I think it's one of the most, well, first of all, it's one of the most quotable verses from, like, just in terms of it being kind of self-contained, being a little self-contained teaching. It's definitely one of the most quotable verses from Nāgārjuna. But another reason I like it is because there's a really interesting, like, contemporary, I don't even know if it's contemporary. It might actually be, because, like, for example, the 8th Karmapa, who I mentioned before, was not really in his, he said that, he was commenting on the real intent of Madhyamaka in doing it when he was commentating on Chandakirti, for example, but he was kind of a yogacharan, like in his own orientation. And it's pretty clear in the way he talks about Madhyamaka. In other texts of his, he actually says, like, Chandrakirti, in thinking that, just like something that is understood through inference and reasoning, breaking apart things and finding they fall apart under analysis is the ultimate, is making a mistake. He doesn't even understand real Madhyamaka, which the 8th Karmapa says is actually about the, I guess, like the experience of all the prapancha having fallen away, which is what the 8th Karmapa, and that's like kind of a more of a yogacara notion. But in sort of this stream, there are some contemporary scholars of yogacara who take this verse as and give it a yogacara interpretation that's very interesting, which is to view prapancha not as the actual superimposition of, like, a reified nature to whatever's there, but actually the basic cognitive structure that allows for reification in the first place, saying, like, all this reification, that actually falls under vikalpa. It's the falsifying conceptualization here, not meaning all the concepts of I and mind, but even a little deeper, all of the superimposing and denying and falling into all of the dualities. And the prapancha is the structure that makes that possible, which for Yogacara Buddhists is subject-object duality. And so then there's the Yogacara interpretation of this, which takes all of the other stuff to be the vikalpa from which karma and klesha arise, and then the prapancha, rather than being, a tendency to reify, is actually just the cognitive structure of intentionality, which is extinguished in this case, emptiness from the Yogacara perspective being emptiness of subject-object duality, being actually reflective of like how the mind actually is, or how the world actually is. And I think that's very intriguing. It's an intriguing take on this verse.
I like completely agree with you, Sagar. And so I had a presentation on Wittgenstein that I gave yesterday on using Madhyamaka to kind of do a reading of Wittgenstein's Tractatus in particular, and like to provide insight into, like, the new resolute readings of Wittgenstein that have been popping up in the last couple decades or so. And I wish I had this verse, because I just, like, I don't know, because this would have been extremely useful. I mean, I think now that I'm looking at it, when we go from actions and defilements arising out of falsifying conceptualizations, and then those arising from hypothesization. I think the Vikalpa to Prapancha move that is being made is, I think, one that Wittgenstein almost gets to but doesn't. And I think so many people have interpreted the Resolute reading as being against sort of the pseudo problems that come up when philosophers talk amongst each other. Like, it's mainly understood as a theoretical problem. But I think this move, and I do think that I really like sympathize with this idea that like Prapancha seems to be a kind of precondition for doing philosophy, right? Like, we need to reify and hypothesize to like have these static images, these static symbols to even then begin the process of doing philosophy. So I think basically what I argued yesterday was Wittgenstein's Tractatus should be taken to have far-reaching implications to ordinary people with ordinary psychologies making sense of the world. And like, no one really, I don't think people really liked it and thought it was very good, what I was trying to do. And they brought up like the fact that Wittgenstein himself was only talking to philosophers of the Tractatus, and he was actually seeing ordinary language and ordinary kind of, like, he almost wanted to, he saw that as a solution to just go back to the way, you know, philosophers have confused things, but ordinary people, they haven't yet. And like, I think the Madhyamaka goes even farther and says ordinary people are also confused. Maybe philosophers are even more tangled up in a way, because they're reifying is kind of on like steroids or something. But ordinary people are already reifying, and I think this passage would have been really helpful for me to, anyways.
And then arguably the Yogacara Buddhist goes even further and says ordinary people are in trouble even before they start talking. Even before they even start thinking, they're already in trouble as soon as they start experiencing the world as in here, out there. They're already in trouble.
I am sympathetic to this view. I'll just say that before I have to dip out now, unfortunately. But thank you so much for letting me be part of this. I'll be back. I hope to be back. And sorry to leave halfway through the.
No, it's totally fine. People have done that.
Yeah, and thanks for keeping this whole thing going and everything as well. All right, take care.
Bye.
See you, Cable. Bye.
So yeah, I don't know. Lately, I've been kind of on a Yogacara kick of sorts. I've been reading the Ratnagotra Vibhaga, which is this very intriguing Yogacara text that was present in like the early Yogacara milieu, like classical Yogacara, like 4th century time, but then somehow got lost in India and then was rediscovered in India in a stupa, like the manuscript of it, and brought to Vikramashila, and they were like, oh, it's an old Yogacara text in a stupa, and it became really popular after that, especially as like a contemplative manual, because it's basically on the unification almost of the Tathagatagarbha Sutra literature with Yogacara, sort of, is what the Ratnagotra Vibhaga is about. And so it emphasizes a lot how the like basic prapancha is in here, out there, which is just like even a pre-thought structure. It's just an experiential structure. Even before you've started thinking of and having abstract objects in your thought and categorizing, even before you started categorizing anything, you're already lacking, I guess, the real ultimate, because you have a sense of in here, out there. And so a lot of it is about the non-dual character of the Tathagatagarbha, which is what's being missed by ordinary beings because of their sense of in here, out there.
Wait, so I have a question. Do you not think the Madhyamaka goes that far, or like, do they not?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Mula Madhyamaka Karika does. I think it's arguable that Nāgārjuna does, but I feel like maybe you have to look at other parts of Nāgārjuna's corpus. The reason being, so far in reading the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, I haven't noticed that. But in other texts of Nāgārjuna that I've read, like, for example, hold on, in his hymns, for example, like in Niropamya Stava, which I think is one of the most beautiful, by the way, Sanskrit Buddhist hymns ever written, but it's by Nāgārjuna. It's really, really good. In that one, he says, in that one, first of all, he exhibits kind of an interesting, what arguably some people would say isn't a Madhyamaka tendency, is a Yogacara tendency, which is in one of the very famous Yogacara texts, the Dharma Tave Bhaga. There's a line that's taken to be very characteristic of a difference between Yogacara and Madhyamaka, which is that from the side of the person who is having their basis of being a sentient being transformed into the basis of being an enlightened one, what's happening is the prapancha is falling away, and then what is left over is a non-dual leftover, basically, is what it says in Dharma Tave Bhaga, and that's the Dharmakaya. And this idea of something left over after a prapancha falls away is taken to be a very Yogacara notion. But in Nāgārjuna's Niropamya Stava, in the 15th verse, he says, the kleshas up to their root, the imprints, he uses the word imprint, the same word that they use in Yogacara. It seems like a Yogacara, vasana. He uses this term.
Oh.
The kleshas up to their root and the vasanas have been subdued by you, O immaculate one. But the ambrosia taken out of the matter constituted by the kleshas has been procured by you. So he says that there's the ambrosia procured out of the kleshas. And then he also says, and then another thing that also kind of maybe exhibits an interesting tendency, which is of like an ekayana tendency, is he says, because of the non-difference in the fundamental nature of dharmas, there's no difference between the vehicles, O Lord, but the three vehicles have been preached by you according to the appearance of beings. Your body is eternal, inalterable, fortunate, made of the Dharma, victorious. But because of men who are to be converted, parinirvana has been displayed by you. And so I feel like there's some interesting
Yeah, so it's a lot, very interesting discussion, and the sort of contrast between Yogacara and Madhyamaka is always a fascinating topic, and seems like a very live discussion contemporaneously, both in the West and in Tibet and other places. Something I think about though is, okay, for one, I'm also very sympathetic of the incredibly forceful view that it's not just that experience has potential to be reified, but that hypostatization is a very condition of possibility of any experience. I think that makes a lot of sense. With how I understand sort of the two truths and ignorance and such. But at the same time, I think so maybe this is just my sort of perspective. Maybe it seems that there's an extent to which for the Yogacaran, or wherever this hypothetical position is, is that there's a sense at which the hypostatizing experience actually happens, and that has to be negated in favor of a non-dual undefiled consciousness that can be posed in contrast to it. And I think the Madhyamaka might be that experience, the hypostatization is a condition of experience, but that even this hypostatization does not happen. even this hypothesization cannot be hypothesized, as and that means that there's actually nothing to gauge in favor of something else. In a way, you sort of just see things as hypothesized, and seeing them as hypothesized is to see them as they are, is to extract the nectar or the ambrosia from the kleshas. That's my interpretation, and how I think the Madhyamaka might be slightly different here, which is almost that like the Yogacara concedes that hypothesized experience is happening. So kind of hypothesizes the process of hypothesization. But I'm sure there's a retort that can be made against that, and more to be said about that. But, yeah, what do you think?
I have maybe this is not maybe this is kind of a dumb question, but is the MMK not a work of Vikalpa then, if it's a work that seeks to conceptualize many of the concepts such as time and motion and wholes and parts, and it seems to me like, and this was kind of my my thesis yesterday, is that the way in which Wittgenstein uses the propositions in the Tractatus is not just an anti-philosophical tool. It's not a negation of metaphysics, but rather it's kind of an affirmation that it's only philosophy that can do something like this. And especially if prapancha is already something that is that everyone is already embroiled in, as soon, or like the Yogacara position goes even farther, even prior to prapancha, it's like just the way that our mind is oriented. Then is it not the case that it's not like, sure, Vikalpa, sorry, can be like adding layers of sedimentation to prapancha or something like this, but it can also undo what prapancha has already done. And this is the proper use of philosophy and theory. And I take this to be that, wouldn't this mean that Nāgārjuna actually sees Vikalpa as like a, maybe something like upaya, like something that really can help us get through these issues of reification and so forth?
This might be
oh, go ahead, Kazi.
Oh, so we say this might be just kind of particular and idiosyncratic to me, but in sort of my own sort of line of thinking that's relatively independent of Madhyamaka studies, but definitely like sort of relates to this, is that there's a way in which sort of philosophy is distinct from just thought as such. I mean, we can understand that thought as such is also just as reified and false as philosophy, but in philosophy is sort of the added incrustation, I guess, of hypothesization. But at the same time, there's a sense in which if philosophy presupposes, the real existence of its objects of analysis, then it's sort of from the very beginning, sort of bound up in this tendency to proliferate conceptions. Whereas, they might be not as effective in actually overcoming hypothesization as other forms of thought, which do not invest in the true existence of things. And I think in that sense, whereas, all conceptions must ultimately be abandoned when abiding in the, true nature of things, there's a sense in which I think that the Madhyamaka views this whole text is vikalpa, but it's not philosophy. It's thought being deployed against conceptions, because and I think related to our discussion about Yogacara, I think Yogacara might be counted as like somewhat philosophical here, because it does posit the true existence of a non-dual undefiled consciousness, right? So it is sort of using philosophy to undermine other kinds of like philosophical ways of thinking, whereas I think the Madhyamaka very much avoids any kind of philosophical positing whatsoever, and is a kind of sort of negative thinking that sort of can be deployed to cease hypothesization. And but this assumes that philosophy is almost intrinsically, maybe that's the risky part, that philosophy is almost intrinsically bound up in the business of proliferating and of hypothesization. So it sort of begs the question of how a business that buys and sells hypothesization will also conduct itself to stop doing that, right? Sort of, I like this sort of somewhat capitalist metaphor in the sense that philosophy is thoroughly invested in its self-reproduction. So it doesn't seem like it makes sense how philosophy can be deployed against itself. And in the history of philosophy, you can kind of see that a lot of different examples of anti-philosophy kind of have just been woven back into the philosophical canon, which is kind of funny and ironic. Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, they're all sort of, another example is there's sort of these negative forms of doing philosophy against the history of philosophy, but they're still very much part of the philosophical canon, which is like a funny thing. Whereas I think, something I'm sort of ambivalent about sometimes is a discussion of whether or not Madhyamaka is philosophy. And at this point, I think, I think I concede that Madhyamikas have done Madhyamaka philosophically, but that might not actually be the genuine deployment of the Madhyamaka as I understand it, as just sort of mere thinking in the service of dissolving hypothesization. Which never ascends to the level of philosophy, which isn't a reason to undermine it, which, if you think philosophy is the hallmark of sophisticated thought, you might think that, oh, by saying that Madhyamaka is not philosophy, you're devaluing it. But actually, it's kind of the reverse from my perspective. When seeing philosophy as bound up in hypothesization, seeing the Madhyamaka thought does not ascend to philosophy is actually a good thing, But I don't know, that's sort of like what I thought with
that was really good, thank you. I think that cleared up a lot of stuff for me. And I think where I sit is we need to, I think, re-envision what philosophy is. Like, I think the New Resolute readings of Wittgenstein are very similar. I think Nāgārjuna in some way intended to re-envision what at least theory was at the time. I mean, he's not averse to theory and clearly uses theory to the highest degree, and it's, like you said, it's very sophisticated. But I guess we have to try to see what are the methods and aims of philosophy, and it seems like the methods that Nāgārjuna uses are all the same as many of the classical Indian schools. It seems like well, with the exception of like the use of the tetralemma and the reductio perhaps, but even then the method is within the bounds of reasoning and deriving conclusions from those. And but the aims, and I think like maybe philosophy can encompass the aims if they are to, I mean, I just see this as a highly potent work of thought, right? And
yeah,
like and this is, I think, the strength of the Kalpa is that it can be more powerful than the other ways of achieving this. Yeah, anyways.
Yeah, it's almost like, philosophy might be an incredibly dulled out knife, and but maybe it's not a good analogy actually. Should forget that. But I was gonna say, you might actually be interested in this post on my blog where I introduced this concept of what I call unphilosophy, which is literally much of what I was just speaking about how there is, in the sort of language that I use, there is thought being used in the service of wisdom, by wisdom, to undo philosophy, basically. So it's kind of like this project of this form of thought which parasitically depends on philosophy, only to show how the philosophy in question, the condition for its possibility, is the occlusion of the goal it's trying to achieve, which is wisdom. It's kind of this funny, ironic critique where like philosophy actually, philosophy as the love of wisdom, as the pursuit of wisdom, necessarily closes itself off from its own goal in the sheer way that it operates. So it's like, if philosophy is, from this perspective, philosophy is based in ignorance necessarily. So there's no way you can go back to wisdom with philosophy. Part of what my project entails is sort of thinking of articulating a mode of thought which directly engages with philosophy, but doesn't participate in philosophy. And it's very sophisticated, but not in the way philosophy is.
Is it neither identical nor distinct to philosophy?
Quite, actually. It's, in a lot of ways, you can kind of see it as my attempt to sort of articulate Madhyamaka without naming it, to have a kind of like, I don't know, like more generalized expression of it, so that people who are not Buddhists might be allured to the Madhyamaka without knowing it. But anyway, now I'm talking too much about my little project. But just to be straight, the project on philosophy would, it would obviously consist of elaborating on what exactly philosophy is, and carefully not trying to do it in a philosophical way, so that this is a kind of hard project. I have to be very self-reflexive the entire time to never accidentally step into extra hypothesization. But it would consist of explaining what exactly philosophy is and why it has to be undone in order to. And the thing about this too, it's very much similar to Nāgārjuna's concern with the Abhidharmikas. He's not telling the Abhidharmikas or anyone of the proponents of the view that like everything you're doing is wrong, stop it. What he's saying is that what you're trying to do is noble, but you're causing yourself to fail in that very noble pursuit. Here's how you continue to steer, here's how you continue to follow your underlying intention, but do it in the correct way. So in this sense, unphilosophy is not actually sort of antithetical to philosophy. More so it's trying to show how philosophy can pursue its own goal, wisdom, by actually seeing how it sort of obstructs itself from its own goal. I don't know. But
I see the problem not with the method or understanding philosophy as a process, but rather with the goals that are in mind and the aims, and kind of like you said, the proliferation of ideas. Like, what is the purpose to proliferate more and more ideas and more theories? Like, if we say, I think the issue with the fundamental verses, like, I would have no problem considering it a work of philosophy, but it is not, in my opinion, a work of metaphysics. And in the sense that Nāgārjuna he's not concerned with giving theories about ultimate truth or like ultimately true theories that that which is the domain of metaphysics, one could argue. But he's rather just getting us to work through these issues using the methods of philosophy.
Yeah, and this is very much related to this sort of disposition that I think is very important for any sort of unphilosophical procedure. Wow, I just like lost myself. What was the last thing you just said?
I was just arguing that, I think maybe it is, we can say that Nāgārjuna is not putting forward a metaphysics, but rather he's just getting us to work through problems in the realm of metaphysics,
right?
In the sense that he's using philosophy as a process, but not a goal in itself. As in, if it were a goal in itself, it would be like interested in the proliferation of itself. And like you said, this seems to be like very much reifying the practice of philosophy and comes with all the problems.
Okay, now I'm reminded. Sorry, short-term memory gap sometimes. But the idea that, sort of the problem of how to engage without participating. So there's a phrase I've been thinking about, and to sort of clarify what exactly I mean by that is like, how do we engage with philosophy and metaphysics without participating in the very thing that it's doing, since we're trying to negate it, right? And I think this is the sort of disposition, the Madhyamaka, that the Madhyamaka must sort of remain in, because if you disengage with philosophy, then you sort of don't actually have a Madhyamaka project. You're not sort of critiquing something. So you're sort of letting people conceptually proliferate. So you engage with it, but your engagement doesn't participate with it, because to participate is to sort of do the very thing that you're trying to critique. So then there's this sort of interesting disposition that the Madhyamaka has to take on its relationship to the thing being refuted, to the philosophy or metaphysics that's being refuted. And and similarly, the way I'm trying to articulate this project of unphilosophy is that you have to maintain this disposition of participating with an existing philosophy to undo it, but you don't, or engage with it to undo it, but you don't like participate with it in like as another philosophical procedure, because then you just sort of completely undermine yourself, right? Because the point of unphilosophy is to undo philosophy, not to do philosophy again. But anyway, now this is a bit of a tangent, but thanks for the conversation where I could plug in one of my projects. And just the last point on that is that, something I was going to before is that while there would consist of just a sort of general, hopefully unphilosophical definition of what philosophy is to understand what philosophy is doing, that's not suffice. It would any particular work would have to consist of an actual analysis of a real philosophical system, something that exists out there. And for my project, I have a couple of contemporary philosophers I'm thinking of to study and sort of attempt an unphilosophical procedure, particularly the people in the speculative realist movement. I find that they're an interesting group to analyze for a contemporary thought. But anyway, all to say, very similar to the Madhyamaka, whereas the Madhyamaka doesn't necessarily have like a sort of philosophical system of tenets that it believes about reality, right? It's a particular mode of immanent critique of an existing form of thought. So in this case, and I think Dan Arnold, contemporary scholar of Madhyamaka, really emphasizes this point that the Madhyamaka is dependent upon the thing that it's analyzing, and it has no true existence of its own, which is, just another instance of the sort of pattern we see in the Madhyamaka, that emptiness is also empty, that, even these teachings are expedient means. The teachings that all things are expedient means is also an expedient means. So in the same way, a Madhyamaka is always dependent on what is critiquing, and in this case, the MMK on the Abhidharma. But let's already getting close to our end time, so let's sort of breeze through some of this.
Really fast, if I could go ahead.
Yes.
I ended up finding the verse that I was looking for. It wasn't actually from Niropamyastava, it was from another one of his hymns. Lokati Tavastava, the hymn to the one who's gone beyond the world. Which I think points to Nāgārjuna perhaps viewing, I think that perhaps points to Nāgārjuna being more of like amenable to the idea that from the experiential sort of emptiness from the side of the subject, as in the Yogacara case, there is a leftover, maybe. Even if we wouldn't want to reify that leftover from, if we as sentient beings, we wouldn't want to then take that as intrinsically existent, from the side of being it's not merely just, it's taking everything to be hypostatized, but then like all things being taken as existent fall away. So first of all, he says numerous times in all of his praises that Buddhas don't perceive objects, which I think is interesting, because that's often thought of as a later Madhyamaka view, but actually Nāgārjuna, because Nāgārjuna doesn't mention it in MMK or Ratnavali, but he does say it in the praises. And then second, he says, without approaching that cultivation practiced by the noble ones, animitta consciousness does not arise in any way. But without approaching what is animitta, there is no liberation, as you have said, hence that has been taught by you in the Mahayana. And translating animitta here is difficult because often animitta means without a cause, but it can also mean without a sign or without a characteristic. as in, like, for example, the pranya paramita triad of what the meditation pranya paramita is, which is emptiness, signlessness, animitta, and wishlessness, desirelessness. Either way, he seems to be saying the cultivation of the noble ones leads to having consciousness that is without characteristics, which I think from a Yogacara perspective, you would say, well, then that has to be consciousness that doesn't have subject-object duality, or would inherently involve apprehension of a characteristic, because there would be the presentation of some object to a subject, which means you would have a nimitta, a form of that. Or if you take it as causeless consciousness, that's harder to understand. I'm not exactly sure what that would mean if you understood it as consciousness without a cause does not arise except through the cultivation practiced by the noble ones. I'm not sure how you would interpret it, what exactly that would mean if you interpret it that way. I think it's more likely that it means consciousness without a sign. And so that would suggest to me then that maybe Nāgārjuna would be amenable to the idea of a non-dual awareness, perhaps. A non-dual and also contentless awareness, which of course is also like a difficult notion to think about.
Right.
But yeah.
I mean, I almost feel like, there's a extent to which I think this Yogacara and a Yogacara aligned view, I don't know, sometimes I feel like it seems like conveniently in the end it falls short of its own rule. And what I mean by that is, like, what is a contentless awareness? I feel like if the idea is that experience is fundamentally based by prapancha as its transcendental condition, then to truly follow through with the reasoning, the absence of any content of experience means there's no awareness. So I don't understand the sort of exception made to this non-defile and non-dual undefiled consciousness.
They don't actually think that it's because of svasamvedana, intransitive awareness. Because the Yogacara, and at least this comes more out, the equation of the non-dual awareness with svasamvedana comes out more in later Yogacara. But basically the idea is that since both subject and object in here and out there are presented when the experience is happening, both of those are part of the presentation of experience. But only the object has the characteristic of being presented as an object. The subject, which is presented, isn't presented as an object, which means its mode of presentation is intransitive. It doesn't have, and I use the word intransitive like the grammatical term intransitive, because it doesn't, like, intransitive verbs don't have agents and objects grammatically. Similarly, they use the intransitive making particle svasamvedana, to make that awareness, or svasamvitti, intransitive. So there's already a sense in which a precondition for having dual awareness is that the subject side of the dual awareness be presented non-dually. So if you stop perceiving objects, like Nāgārjuna says, then you'll just have the intransitive awareness that was before presenting the subject, but now isn't presenting anything in particular. It's just mere presentation, I guess. And that's perhaps why Dharmakirti uses the metaphor of prakasha, luminosity, but like it's like luminosity that's not illuminating anything and doesn't have a source of the illumination. It's like if you imagined a possible world with no objects, and then like said, now like present it, the presentation of no objects, I guess. It's not, I don't know if I'm making any sense with this. Or if you imagine like empty space with nothing filling the space, and then a light in that empty space, but without a source for the light. It's just presentation, but there's nothing being presented. That's what I think the later Yogacharans think is happening when you have, that's what they think it means for the meditator, or for like from the side of the subject to get to realize emptiness. If you're realizing emptiness, then you're realizing these objects don't exist. So the content, perceiving objects, falls away. But then the precondition for even having perception of objects in the subject-object structure was the intransitive awareness that's just the mere presentation of objects in consciousness. So then all you're left with is just presentation without content.
I see. Okay, so it seems like this this sort of reflexive dimension of awareness, which I think refers to, which is what is referred to by Swasam Vedana, right?
Yeah.
This sort of I don't know if this is the right way to say, self-containing aspect of awareness. I feel like, you know, you might end up like, you know, belaboring this point or this conversation, but so we don't have to do this, but it does seem like the first thing I think of is like, okay, so like intention. So we can think about intentional awareness, which, you know, ascertains objects, which presupposes a subject-object structure. And then there's this reflexive dimension of consciousness. So we can ask, are they identical or distinct? You know, and if they're identical, then they come at the same time. If they're distinct, then Swasam Vedana is, you know, temporally antecedent. And I feel like, you know, I don't know, there might be issues with either one. And then that sort of potentially disrupts the very distinction between this reflexive dimension awareness and intentional awareness, as if you can divorce them from each other.
But this this issue arises no matter what, as soon as you believe in nirvana. Even if you believe in nirvana from a madhyamika perspective, you will end up raising the similar issue, because you'll say, okay, so the reason why I am not in nirvana is because of the presence of prapancha, but prapancha isn't real. So is my prapancha a feature of my consciousness, or is it not a feature of my consciousness? Well, vijnana isn't actually ultimately real. It's even that is just appearing in dependence upon prapancha. Oh, but is prapancha appearing in dependence upon prapancha? Right, like for any anti-foundationalist, there will seemingly be a problem, perhaps, or there will at least be the initial worry that there will be a problem, whether you're on a madhyamika side or a yogacara side, about how we're supposed to understand the relationship between samsara and nirvana. That seems like what you're touching on here with, is the non-dual awareness identical with the consciousness that has the dual awareness, or is it distinct? It's just the same question as, is samsara and nirvana distinct or identical? It's the same question, because for the yogacara, the non-dual awareness is nirvana. That's what it means to be in nirvana, because that's the awareness that lacks prapancha. Specifically the root prapancha of subject-object duality. So I think that the madhyamika also posits a non-difference between samsara and nirvana. So either this problem is not resolvable for either, or the problem is resolvable for both, I think.
Sagar, I just have a question. I don't really know much about any of the stuff that you are discussing, but this idea of Swasam Vedana, it seems to, my preliminary thoughts are, it seems to reject the idea of consciousness arising out of the dhatus and the ayatanas and all of this. And of course, which is, an Abhidharma way of understanding how feelings and volitions and all of these things arise. And I was wondering, if you reject this, do you not have to accept the absurd conclusion that consciousness is causeless? And how does the Madhyamaka get around that? Or the Yogacharan?
So there are two streams, I guess, of Yogacara in this. One of them is the stream that thinks that causality is real. So that's actually different. That's a big difference from Madhyamaka.
This is the Yogacara Satantrika, or that stream?
Yogacara Sautrantika does, well, it's kind of debatable, because some people who are called Yogacara Sautrantika, like Dharmakirti, it's kind of debatable whether they believed in causality. Because at one point in Dharmakirti's auto-commentary to his Pramanavartika, he raises an interlocutor who's just like, causality is just conventional. Like, because he's talking about causality, and the interlocutor says, causality is just conventional though. And Dharmakirti replies, sure, whatever. Like that. He doesn't respond to it, but he's just like, whatever, dude.
Yeah,
so it's not actually clear if he's agreeing or if he's disagreeing with that, or if he just thinks it doesn't matter. Most people, I think a lot of people lean towards thinking he just doesn't want to take a stance on causal realism because he thinks it doesn't matter, because then he proceeds to say causal relations are a feature of the experience of sentient beings. And that's what he kind of reduces his position down to. So maybe he's saying, yeah, sure, they're conventional, but they're worth dealing with because I'm in samsara. What am I going to do? Maybe he's saying they're actually real. Not exactly clear, but he does. It seems like he understood the problem because he raises it as an interlocutor in the thing, only to not exactly really give a response.
It's like the anti-Nāgārjunian method.
Yes, exactly.
I'm not bringing up an objection to respond to it, but rather to bring up an objection to just say, well, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
This is in the Pramana Vartika.
It's in the auto commentary.
Oh, okay, I need to read I need to read more Dharmakirti.
And then so in these two streams, in one of the streams where they think causality is real, they would say consciousness isn't causeless. One moment of consciousness is caused by another moment of consciousness that just like preceded it temporally. Because they also believe, if they believe that causal succession is real, they believe, you know, in a succession of, and so they would just say it does have a cause. Its cause is another moment of consciousness rather than the ayatanas and the dhatus or whatever. And then that's one view. And so under that view, you would have like an infinite causal chain, but that's true even if you believe in the ayatanas and the dhatus, because you still end up having to go back temporally infinitely. So they just kind of collapse the whole Abhidharma thing into just like successions of mental moments, basically. And then in the other strand where they don't think causality is ultimately real, I guess they just don't think it's a problem to suggest that ultimately the mind doesn't have a cause. And they would just say, and conventionally speaking, the causes of mental events to arise are other preceding mental events. And they would just say like, and they would just do a similar thing to Madhyamikas, I think, probably, and just say like, it's just like a sort of a story that's told about experience that these things precede these other things, and these are the causes of these other ones. And they would just say that it's vikalpa.
But sorry, if they respond like that, then they are saying that consciousness is not causeless, because they're saying every mental event is preceded by another mental event and therefore has a cause. So it's not really, so they're kind of just saying, so no Yogacharan would take a view such as mind is causeless.
No, I think that some of them say that mind is ultimately ultimately it's causeless because ultimately causality isn't real. Just like
oh, I see. Okay.
They'll do a two truths thing. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Whereas then there's the other strand where they actually think ultimately causality is real, and actually mind is ultimately not causeless and conventionally not causeless. Mind is there's an actual real succession of mind.
So the first view makes sense to me because it's saying like, well, since causality as a concept doesn't refer, no problem with saying it's causeless. But yeah. The second seems very bizarre to me, and I'm curious.
I also agree that the second seems quite bizarre. It ended up becoming, I think, like eventually, although I think this is oddly not even because of its philosophical issues, but maybe even more because of the sort of pushback from contemplatives, actually from meditators who influence. There's this always in the history of Buddhist philosophy, this like push and pull between the testimony of meditators and that affecting philosophy, and then the systematization of scholastics and that affecting philosophy, and influences coming in multiple directions from this. And then there's just like this period starting in like the 7th century all the way like to the high Middle Ages of Yogacara aligned meditators who insisted that causality, that in the sort of ultimate realization that comes from meditating on emptiness, there is no succession of causally related mental events. There's no succession at all. There's no, and so then there ends up being like a pushback, I think, against causality and time being real. in
I have
motion.
I have a quick question. Could we say for this view that perhaps in meditative equipoise, when you're just resting in the reflexive nature of mind, then there's no basis to posit a causal series. But that from a post-meditative analytic point of view, you can still claim that for there to be this mind, there has to exist in a succession of causal moments. Can you say that?
You could, but then wouldn't that be saying, from a perspective that lacks prapancha, there's no, from when I was in equipoise, I did not have any, when I was in equipoise, I had no prapancha. I was doing no hypostatization. And from that perspective, so to speak, if we were to talk about that perspective, although even that's just kind of metaphorical, right? Because it doesn't really have a perspective because there's no subject object, there's no causality or succession. And now I am out of equipoise, and I can describe that as having had a succession, even though said succession was not perceived in that time. But right now, necessarily, because I'm not in equipoise, I have to consider myself to be under the sway of prapancha.
Right.
So why should I trust my theorizing right now and not trust the experience of the equipoise before? And I think that would be the argument that would have been made by the contemplatives who pushed back against this, was why would you trust the theorizing by philosophers of mind after equipoise instead of just trusting the equipoise, especially if the equipoise is the one that we're saying realizes emptiness in the sense that it lacks any prapancha.
Okay, no, I totally see this. So I guess like if you're gonna make this move at all, you would say that the post-meditative view is a sort of conventional device to possibly assist in meditative equipoise. I guess it could be useful to the extent that, you know, like if you actually have the idea that it was caused, that, you know, consciousness had a cause, then you might, in meditation, you might actually try to find it. You might try to establish that. Whereas if there's no establishing going on at all, you might just say that, like, you know, conventionally speaking, there's a causal series, moment to moment causal series of the mind, which is spontaneous. So there's no need to deliberate on any kind of, you know, objective analysis. So that conventional view might help you comport yourself in meditation such that you're optimally abiding in non-intentional reflexive awareness.
Yeah, so maybe that conventional view is a prerequisite almost to dispensing with the, like, it's like a ladder that you can only throw aside from the top.
Yeah,
if we were
so,
going to use
you know,
the
speaking
Wittgenstein.
of Wittgenstein, yeah.
Yeah, speaking of Wittgenstein, it's imagine if you have a ladder that you can knock over, but you can't knock it over from the bottom. Because let's say it's held by some hinges at the top. So you have to climb to the top before you can knock it over. It's not held in place or fixed. It's not, you can totally knock it over, but you can't do so from the bottom without having climbed it.
Yeah. This actually reminds me a little bit about someone I've been reading lately, which is a Tibetan Gorompa Sonam Sengye, and his system is very much ladder-like in the sense that he's very much a kind of like, you know, a huge emphasis on, I guess, like a direct immediate experience of a sort of non-dual awareness, but he's very like he seems very concerned of distinguishing himself from, you know, the typical Chinese straw man in Tibet, Hashang Mahayana, who's like this sort of just, you know, naive immediatist who just thinks that you can drop all concepts and just like rest in the nature of mind, where, I mean, that is the goal for Gorompa, but for him, a logical procedure of analysis, particularly through the gradual analysis of each of the four lemmas of the tetralemma, that they're actually necessary preconditions for that realization of non-conceptual awareness, but that you have to ascend the ladder before you can tip it away to actually get to the point, which is interesting. You know, it's interesting to see a point that is fundamentally pivoted around, or a view that's fundamentally pivoted around non-dual, non-conceptual awareness, but that still sees a very important role played by reason to get to that point. But instead, you know, but at the same time, I sort of think sometimes about the story about what Chandrakirti, you know, being asked by inherent existence. I may be butchering this like story, but like a couple of, I think you told me this actually, Sagar, about a couple of monks sort of teasing him about like, oh, if everything's empty, you know, like why there's solid things, and Chandrakirti like waves his hand through a pillar. It's like, what solid thing, right?
Yeah, the pillar story.
Yeah, like, and you know, instead of climbing the ladder, and you know, maybe you just sort of walk through whatever wall the ladder is trying to get you over to, which is just my point to think that, like, I don't know, like while I definitely vibe with this idea of like using this sort of logical procedure as a necessary prerequisite to, you know, the final result, there's an extent to which I think the final result is sort of already like possible at every moment, but this might be you know, a bit of my, I think, Dzogchen influence here, that there seems like, you know, there's the extent to which it seems like you know, even the highest point of the ladders, point, quote unquote, it might be most approximate to, you know, how things are, but it almost seems like, to the extent that they're based on prapancha, you know, it's only as good, the top of the ladder is only as good as the bottom, you know, and so it's kind of like, you know, at this point the metaphor of the ladder breaks down, and this sort of the idea is like, how can we just go past this border without a ladder, you know, which isn't to say that you can't use a ladder, you know, but maybe we can wave our bodies through the wall, you know, gaining Chandrakirti's insight.
Now I want to know how long I have to study Madhyamaka before I can start walking through walls. Like, this is what I'm here for.
Yeah.
I actually think this is discussed in Madhyamakavatara.
Okay.
Well, actually, funnily enough, I'm pretty sure Chandrakirti mentions in Madhyamakavatara at what level of the like 10 stages of power of bodhisattvas, like ordinary material obstacles become fake for them. I think he actually mentioned, because Madhyamakavatara is framed even as a summary of the 10 grounds sutra, which is the sutra on the 10 stages of a bodhisattva's power. It is a text on the main Madhyamaka arguments according to Chandrakirti, but it's like put in this frame of a poem about ascending through the 10 grounds of a bodhisattva. And so he talks at great length about basically how a bodhisattva's power increases with their wisdom, which for him is the wisdom of emptiness. And so he talks about all the powers and stuff, and I think he might mention this.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention, speaking of ladder metaphors, Bhava Viveka has a great one, and in the Madhyamaka Hridaya, he writes, without the ladder of correct conventional truth, it is not possible for one to ascend to the top of the palace of ultimate truth.
Yeah, so that's exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, yes.
That's cool. But so you have to, the ultimate truth is that there's, you know, nothing there, and is that everything's empty, so there's not really anything that is ultimate to ascend to.
Right.
But nevertheless, you can't kick out the ladder from the bottom.
I also wonder though, like this might be a subtle sort of like, I don't know, again, a subtle way of trying to go against this current. It's like, okay, what if the ladder, you know, is highly useful and probably most people need it, but like, you know, Gorampa seems to almost claim that we absolutely need to go through this logical process, which is almost sort of seems to sneak in something of inherent existence to me. So my idea is like, can we also just teleport to the city, right?
Yeah. Speaking of teleporting and of the Dzogchen, there's a poem by Mipam, which I think is one of my favorite of his writings. Even though it's really short and it's not like a popular or commonly read poem of his. And in it, he says, so Mipam basically actually did seemingly, Mipam believed in non-dual awareness, and actually not only that, but unlike most Dzogchen like people, was willing to do what basically was accepting of the Mahamudra equivocation between the reflexive awareness of the Yogacharans and the non-dual awareness of Vajrayana. This is a thing in Mahamudra. Mahamudra, as a Vajrayana meditation movement, spawned in great connection with Yogacara, because a lot of the Mahamudra masters were people who became Vajrayana Buddhists after first being scholars of Yogacara. Like this is true of Maitripa, this is true of Saraha, and so on. So there's like this connection philosophically between Yogacara and Mahamudra as a Vajrayana meditation movement. And there's this then equation of the Vajrayana non-dual awareness as just being that very reflexive awareness that does the presentation of the subject side in subject-object duality in Mahamudra. And this was generally not accepted in Dzogchen. In fact, Longchenpa, I think, explicitly rejects this, but Mipam actually does accept this. And so what he says is the dharma dhatu, which is beyond conception, is experienced individually and intransitively in space like meditative equipoise. How is this a limited nature? Chitta matrans believe consciousness to be real, but here, intransitive awareness is great emptiness. In actual direct experience, any rigid notions of concepts of true existence fall apart. Whoever experiences this open space of unity sees the actual nature of all phenomena, for if each thing had its own separate nature, there would be no end to all these natures. Thus it is through the experiential approach of settling meditatively in the space of unity that you can come to realize what would be the fruit of many eons of philosophical speculation. That bit at the end reminds me of teleporting past the philosophizing.
I also like
Yeah.
to, I mean, I think I want to point out that it's not like the latter has any anything intrinsic about it, right? It's not like there's any intrinsic rungs to it that they have to be a particular way. It's not that the rungs have to represent a particular step in the path to the, say, the using Baba Viveka's analogy, the palace of ultimate truth. And I find this to be a highly subjective ladder in the sense that it is whatever the cognizer needs to ascend to the palace of the ultimate truth. And in that sense, if it's meditative equipoise, that works. But if it's also like in my thesis, I basically argue that the rungs of the ladder are something like, or can be something like Baba Viveka's use of the logical tools of Dignaga to elaborate on Madhyamaka philosophy. They can be that too for the logician and the philosopher who needs to understand Madhyamaka this way.
So then maybe going back then to how we started all of this, which is how to understand, is the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka just a Vikalpa? Maybe it is, and that's fine, because the ladder itself being kind of subjective and itself a manner of construct, for some people is long and has these rungs that can be climbed, and the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka analyses are like the rungs of the ladder for those kind of people. And for other people, the ladder may almost be like infinitesimally small, such that they just take a single step and they're at the top and they've climbed the ladder. And that is, say, Mipam's direct experiential approach that realizes what would otherwise be something of many eons of philosophical speculation. And hopefully you're not having to contemplate Madhyamaka for many eons, but maybe there's, some people's ladders are set up to be preceded up by the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, but that means it's still just sort of this subjective kind of like individually relevant, but not necessarily, not taken to be how it must be for everyone, and so lacking its own intrinsic nature. Ladder for some people to climb, and other people just take the single step, which is the immediate approach.
There is a sense.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. No, there's a. I totally jive with a lot of that. That like that to the extent that we conceive of a ladder, it's also not the same ladder for everyone too. Though it does seem that especially the Nāgārjuna, who I've been sort of looking at through a constant Kasser sort of dissertation on him. I think she's coming out with the actual book on him. That's not out yet. But typical of certain kinds of very, I think, polemical Madhyamikas, there is this sort of sense in which, like, okay, like, sure, the latter might be subjective and relative to who it is, but like almost kind of like this sort of transcendental scheme inevitably everyone has to eventually go through Madhyamaka. And for Garampa, you literally have to start from the first limb of the tetralemma, get that right, and then go to the second one, and then all the way to the fourth until you can truly learn to relinquish prapancha, to cease conceptualization. So it's almost like there's a somewhat of a relativizing wiggle room, but somehow still subordinated to the scheme where Madhyamaka is still this sort of necessary last prerequisite before you can actually cease all concepts, because before that everything is still conceptually mediated, no matter how far it gets you up to a ladder almost. But
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I
It
think
actually really reminds me of scholarship around Wittgenstein, actually. I know I keep bringing him up, but the fact that like the rungs of the ladder have been there's been so much scholarship on what these rungs are, whether there are like certain rungs that Wittgenstein imagined us to ascend, whether there's anything intrinsic about them or whether it's like part of the psychological process of going through the propositions oneself and arriving at the conclusion at the end. And it just reminds me that there's like everything from the absolute relativization of the rungs on the ladder to like very definite steps in the scholarship. And it's very similar to sort of this, you said Garampa has a very rigid understanding of the ladder, and it just reminds me like, yeah, these discussions are just, and I feel like this is something that can be discussed within literature, like there is no clear answer.
I will say this is a great conversation, but we should probably steam through the rest of the verses before we lose some time. But I do want to say, I just said that, now I'm sort of going a little back to what we talked about. But before I lose it, I do want to say, and I want to preface before what I say what I'm going to say, which is that I'm working off of the English translation of this verse, and you can translate probably differently the actual Sanskrit, but in verse 5, where it says, actions and defilements arise because of falsifying conceptualizations. Those arise from hypostatization, yada, yada. And, so we're assuming that with emptiness, we extinguish hypostatization, which also extinguishes falsifying conceptualization. I feel like, this might not be like a well thought out idea, but it seems like it doesn't say actions and defilements arise because of false concepts, but because of falsifying conceptualizations. So there's a kind of, active process here of conceptualizing that's happening, that's sort of deliberated. And then it makes me think, okay, well, can you have concepts without the deliberation of them? And so I'm almost thinking like, what if like conceptualization is a sort of imminent necessary precondition of all awareness, like we've sort of established in our previous discussion. And that for any experience to happen, there's at least this initial level of conception that's almost automatic and a necessary precondition for all experience, a transcendental condition for experience. So to the extent, let's say we can say that an awakened mind does experience, then perhaps it does go through the same process of conception, but doesn't conceptualize in the way that an ordinary being might, that sort of adds on to the initial moment of hypostatization to further encrust reality on the thing being thought of. And understanding that all phenomena are momentary and impermanent, we can kind of take it, this is how I take it from almost Dzogchen point of view, meditative point of view, is that if all existence are self-liberated, right? So I see no contradiction necessarily between the idea that awakened mind, that awakened awareness consists of conceptions, but that they're immediately self-liberated and not subject to further subsequent arising, which is what sentient beings do. And so I guess where I'm getting at here is that it almost seems like for me, my Madhyamaka point of view here is that what remains, ironically, after ultimate analysis is sort of the very thing that was there in the first place. So instead of like instead of analyzing appearances to negate them such that non-dual reflexive awareness remains, which is something different from the conventional appearances. What if when we analyze conventional appearances as being merely appearances, what remains, ironically, is the thing that we were with the whole time. So like, that there's nothing outside of the conventional that remains after analysis. All we're remaining with, which is not even to say remaining, all that's left intact is conventions, but our mode of awareness onto it has changed. So that, I do think that means the character of experience is significantly different, perhaps, between a sentient being and a Buddha, but that a sentient being and a Buddha still both share the same transcendental structure to their experience as being constructed at least by this initial moment of hypothesization. So I don't know if this is doing some bad moves here by like sort of allowing there to be ignorance within a Buddha, but I feel like there's an extent to which maybe there's like a sort of basic necessary functional ignorance that's necessary for cognition for experience to happen at all, but there's something extra that sentient beings do that a Buddha doesn't do. So a Buddha is not truly ignorant in the sense that it doesn't not know, it knows these conceptions to be what they are, it's mere conceptions. So I don't know, I guess just the way I'm thinking about how a Madhyamaka might approach this idea of what remains after analysis that's distinct from a Yogacara view that might say that what remains is something other than what's just been conventionally appearing.
So I wonder if reification and conceptualization, if they're the only targets of our analysis in, say, the MMK, and we have a kind of denial of the intrinsic nature of many of the metaphysical concepts that are addressed in the MMK, is there a risk? And like this is, I think this is just for me trying to work this out, and maybe this is like very clearly answered, but it seems, I guess, at first glance that there's a risk of like reifying a lot of the metaphysical at the psychological for the Madhyamaka, to say, look, it's not the metaphysics that are intrinsically real, and thus every time we try to theorize about concepts like time and motion, we run into trouble because of, well, none of it exists with intrinsic nature. But what can be said to be true is that we have there is clearly something about our psychology that is already not a Buddha or something, or an enlightened being. And that problem comes with reifying things to posit the existence of things that don't ultimately exist. And I guess the move from the, I wonder if what they succeed at in doing, the Madhyamaka, at least in the MMK with Nāgārjuna, what they succeed in doing at the metaphysical level, I wonder if there's a risk if you don't understand, of course, if you don't understand emptiness properly, like a mishandled snake is what Nāgārjuna says. I wonder if there's a risk of reifying at the psychological that's like seems very, very it always seems present to me in Madhyamaka, the risk of doing this. Anyways.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of my sort of concern about, articulating Madhyamaka as something that's a sophisticated thought that's not philosophy. I think part of that is sort of try to understand, like, how can we deploy Madhyamaka and ensure that we don't even run into the risk of, doing this accidental reification, But anyway, just to finally get back to the text, though I think we can sort of breeze through some of the following ones. Verse 7, verse 6. The self is conveyed and non-self is taught by Buddhas. It is taught as well that neither self nor non-self is the case. And I think we can, okay, let me just comment on that. So here it says that, so self is conveyed, non-self is taught. So conveyed and taught, that's an interesting distinction. I think that sort of refers to how sort of Her teachings, I particularly think about like actually the Dhammapada, where there's like the Buddha says a lot, like, you have a self, take care of yourself, love yourself, yada yada. So there's a real teaching of the Buddha, in which the sort of self that's implicitly taken on by the listener is sort of assumed. But then there's the teaching on non-self, of course, the famous teachings on anatta, and by extension, emptiness. But it's also taught as well that neither self nor non-self is the case. Yeah, I mean, that's important, I think, to point out that these views are merely expedient means that the Buddha uses to bring the listener to their own awakening, but that don't actually have any sort of ultimately real referent points. Yeah. Is there anything else you can say? Well, yeah, we can move on to the next verse 7. The domain of objects of consciousness having ceased, what is to be named is ceased. The nature of things is to be, like nirvana, without origination or cessation. So the way I sort of interpreted this with help of the commentary is that without any truly existent objects, there's no real basis for designating any term, including that of being empty. So that entails that the nature of things like nirvana is to be without origination or cessation, is to say that everything is primordially unarisen. This idea of the primordially unarisen nature of things, that the commentary sort of points to how this might be the necessary correlate of the meditational state of the signless that the Buddha says immediately precedes the attainment of nirvana. So on one level, you might see a thing, break it down into its parts and see that the thing is just a projection. Onto something else, then you might see that the projection itself is not a projection, it's not a superimposition onto something, but itself is a mere precept of a virtual nature. So this is kind of the Yogacara view, I think. Or you can see it as empty of any true existence, and in there there's still something, there's a sign of something, and you have to qualify it as empty. But then to actually ascend to the level of the unarisen nature of things, once you see that the sign is empty, you then don't even have a thing. You don't even have a sign for there to be qualified as empty. I think this correlates to the Madhyamaka. I mean, all to say that the Madhyamaka insight into the unarisen nature of things correlates to this signless nature of meditation that leads to nirvana. Okay, so the next two verses are kind of cool. So 8, this is also kind of a famous one, and I like this one a lot. Verse 8, all is real or all is unreal. All is both real and unreal. All is neither unreal nor real. This is the greater teaching of the Buddha. And this is really great. And so the way I sort of understood this here is that this is a positive tetralemma. So usually we have a negative tetralemma, which we sort of negate each of the different extremes of a given position on the, typically of the reality or unreality or existence or non-existence of something. Here we have a positive tetralemma that sort of affirms on the conventional level ways in which we can understand reality that the Buddha has taught, but that this positive tetralemma the whole thing must be seen with reference to a negative tetralemma that refutes inherent existence. So we can rehabilitate conventional existence in the tetralemmaical form. So the way I understood this is, all is real could, refers to the conventional truth of existence that can be, verified by conventional awareness. 2, all is unreal. This emphasizes the ultimate truth of emptiness. that, these conventional things are ultimately empty. Then you have both real and unreal. This we can kind of understand as sort of the harmony, unity, coalescence, indivisibility, however you want to say, of the two truths. So this is sort of, this whole discourse on the unity of emptiness and appearance, the unity of luminosity and emptiness, like this sort of, these teachings based on the mutually supportive nature of the two truths. And then 4, you have, neither unreal nor real. And the way I understand this, to think about in terms of the Buddhist teachings, is I kind of include that in the sort of mind-to-mind transmission that's part of the Buddhist teachings. So maybe the first 3 of Positive Tetralemma exist as oral transmissions of the teachings. Whereas the 4th one is a direct mind-to-mind transmission. And I think about the flower sermon, and it's a good example of that, of this sort of non-conceptual direct teaching of the ultimate nature of things, which doesn't teach that something is either real or unreal. It's just sort of, brings about in the disciple this recognition of their mind. But of course, even that is not, indicative of the ultimate nature of things. It itself is sort of conditioned for further practice, right? So even if you have a sort of direct introduction of the nature of mind, that introduction itself is not necessarily the ultimate nature of things. That's what's to be cultivated as the fruit that's taken up as the path, or as the ground of your path. Yeah, and this is an interesting verse. So any of you have a comment on that? On this verse? You don't have to. So we can move now immediately to the following verse, which is cool because so verse 8 was the sort of positive tetralemma. We can even say cataphatic characterization of the teachings.
As opposed to this apophatic one.
And this will be the apophatic one, yes, where the nature of reality is characterized negatively. So I'll read. Not to be attained by means of another, free from intrinsic nature, not populated by hypostatization, devoid of falsifying conceptualization, not having many separate meanings. This is the nature of reality. And I want to point out real quick here, again, at some point I have to understand Sanskrit and Tibetan and actually be able to get deeper with this, but right now I'm dealing with the English translation. Not populated by hypostatization does not say the sheer absence of hypostatization. We're not populated by it, but maybe this is me trying to wiggle my way into introducing hypostatization where there shouldn't be. But yeah, so it's almost like maybe the nature of experience has this sort of condition that makes it hypostatized. And maybe this is the nature of our experience of reality. And that additional hypostatization obscures the fact that the initial moment was already hypostatized. Anyway, that's my little feedback into what I said previously. But yeah, if we go through some of the individual points here, not by means of another. So that means that the nature of reality has to be a direct experience for oneself, free of intrinsic nature, without hypostatization or falsifying conceptualization. We've sort of elaborated on that a lot. Not having multiple meanings. And I think that one way to sort of refer to this or explain this is a sort of pithy quote attributed to Nāgārjuna, which is that all things have one nature, and that is no nature. So, to say that reality doesn't have any separate meanings is to say that there has a single nature, which is that of emptiness. There's no different modes of existence other than that. And so even that one nature is also no nature.
I'm quite confused actually by prapanchaira prapanchitam, because aprapanchitam is just, lacking prapancha, but prapanchair is just prapancha, but in the instrumental case, meaning like with or by means of. So it's like lacking prapancha by means of prapancha would be my literal reading. I don't know what that means. So now I'm looking at what Chandrakirti says. I just pulled up Prasannapada.
This makes me think of what I was sort of trying to get at here, that there might be this initial automatic moment of a hypothesized structure to experience, but that abiding in the ultimate nature of reality, part of that is not this active process of hypothesization. And what you said about this sort of instrumental use of the notion, so this makes you think of that.
It's not clear to me that is Siddharth's translating prapanchair, which is the instrumental prapancha, as by means of another.
No. See, what he's translating as by means of is apara pratyayam, because
and Shantam is free.
Yeah, Shanta's free, and I'm assuming he's following Chandrakirti in saying specifically the free is free from because it doesn't say free from intrinsic nature. He's inserting those brackets because that's what Chandrakirti seems to say. Is what the Shant, it's like.
So the whole phrase prapanchair aprapanchitam is not populated by hypothesization.
That is what Siddharth is doing.
Then I agree with you, Saga. That is very strange.
And so para is like, it has a cognate, this prefix, but it means like remote, so like other. And then pratyaya is like ascertainment, comprehension.
So it's not like grasp, right?
Yeah. So apara pratyayam, so not attaining by means of another is apara pratyayam. Para pratyayam would be like
grasp,
ascertaining by means of something else. So apara pratyayam is not doing that. So then Chandrakirti says, therefore it is prapanchaira prapanchitam. And what does he mean by that? He elaborates. Sorry, just deciphering the Sanskrit. My Sanskrit's so bad, so I have to decipher. I cannot. Prapanche.
Yeah, I am so envious of you guys. Some kind of Sanskrit. I mean, I guess I can learn, but.
So, is there a sense in could the apara pratyayam be joined with prapanchair in a way that says not to be attained by means of another? So referring to
not to be attained by means of another. Grammatically, that doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
The pratyayam is declined such that it co-refers with Shantam and aprapanchitam, not with prapanchair.
Right. Yeah, which is why it doesn't see yeah, I'm just trying to make sense of this because otherwise I have no idea.
Is your issue the English translation, or is it the actual Sanskrit verse? Which one is confusing?
I think the translation is confusing to me.
I think the actual verse is also confusing.
Okay.
The verse if taken as it is, yeah. I mean, the reason why I'm trying to the reason why the verse is confusing is I can only make sense of it if I do something that's grammatically incorrect, which is tie the panchair with the apara pratyayam, because if I don't, then I don't really understand what's going on here, and how you could have hypothesization by means of hypothesization.
Yeah. So how would you guys translate prapancha aprapanchitam?
Literally, it seems to mean lacking prapancha by means of prapancha. That's what it literally seems to say. And then,
Yeah, I mean, that like totally vibes with like exactly what I've been thinking of a little bit. You know, the idea that like, you know, there might be this necessary initial state of hypothesization for there to be any kind of reality to consider or be aware of, but that the nature of reality, as we can understand it in our experience, is not populated by further hypothesization by means of the experience we're having, which is already hypothesized. So it's almost, to me, it almost indicates that there is a hypothesized nature to our experience of reality, and that this is the nature of our reality. And so above that, there's no further hypothesization by hypothesization. There's just that first level. Does that like, I'm not saying this is what's true about this verse and what it's saying, but you guys kind of understand like where I'm trying to get at by interpreting it that way.
yeah.
What's puzzling to me is that Siddharth and Katsura don't even seem to try to translate prapanchaya. Like, or actually, it seems like they're not even translating a prapanchitam, and not populated by hypothesization seems to be the translation of prapanchaya.
Yeah, so Chandrakirti's gloss on this is very brief and also kind of hard to. So what Chandrakirti says is, okay, Ata eva tat prapanchayara panchitam. So he's just restating. Prapancho hi vak prapanchayati arthan iti krita. So having said that, is the goal. Prapancho hi vak. Having said, indeed, speech in prapancha, that is the goal. By means of speech.
The second part of the verse seems fine, like
Yeah.
irvikalpam being understood as devoid of falsifying conceptualization, ananartham being not having many separate meanings, or not. Yeah, that makes sense. And then etat tatvasya lakshanam. So this is the lakshanam of reality, or this is the nature, you could say a characteristic of reality.
Yeah.
That all makes sense. I just don't understand why they kind of, it seems like they didn't even translate aprapanchitam. Is this what you get, Sagar, or do you
Yeah, I don't get it. Not populated by hypostatization. What are they going for there?
That's prapanchaya, I think, because by has the instrumental sense. So by hypothesization is prapanchaya. I think they just didn't translate it.
Oh my gosh. I think I know what. Wait, maybe this is a pun. So because prapancha doesn't just mean conceptual proliferation or hypostatization. Prapancha also just means like copiousness or appearance phenomenon. So maybe Nāgārjuna is using the double meaning of prapancha here. So he's saying it is aprapanchitam in the sense of not manifesting, not being proliferated in not being manifold in prapanchaya, like by conceptual proliferation.
You're no longer You're no
Okay.
longer prapunchaing prapuncha, basically.
Yes, exactly. You're not prapunchaing prapuncha. Yeah, maybe that's what they're going for. And that, okay, I
Okay,
see.
yeah, I get it now. That's really cool.
Wait, but
Why
that
did
doesn't
they? Why
that
did
doesn't
the
sound like
professor not mention this pun? That would have made it so much easier.
Yeah, that's funny. So
No,
that
I
yeah,
like
so
that.
they're translating the prapuncha in aprapunchatam as populating, like manifesting, which is one of the meanings of prapuncha. And then they're translating the other prapuncha in prapunchai and in prapunchehi as hypostatization, which is something that they did not explain, but is interesting.
Yeah. Okay. That was. Yeah. This first was bothering me.
Well, do we have any other points before we try to finish off the last 3 verses? Okay, cool. And also, I'll just keep reiterating. I feel like all the discussion just sort of reiterates this point I'm trying to make that, I don't know, might have some substance to it, which is that yeah, but not populated by hypostatization doesn't mean that hypostatization is not happening at all. Because to say that there's a possibility of there being a population by hypostatization is to assume that there is hypostatization happening to some extent. So maybe that minimal level of hypostatization does happen when considering the nature of reality, but not in a way that obscures it because it's not populated by further hypostatization, other than that initial moment that you're reflexively aware as being merely hypostatized. But anyway, maybe at some other point I can flesh that idea out more. But okay, verse 10. When something exists dependent on something as its cause, that is not on the one hand identical with that cause, but neither is it different. Therefore, that cause is neither destroyed nor eternal. So it's a cool, very stock argument, structure of argument that 2 necessarily related things like cause and cause, or effect and cause, asking whether or not it's identical or distinct and finding a basis for refuting both of them. Here, it's glossed over that the cause is not identical with the caused, because that would mean that the effect is pointless. Because if it's identical, that means that whatever the effect was already in the cause. So there's no point of there being an effect. So that doesn't hold. It also doesn't hold that the caused is distinct from the cause, because that would mean that there's no real relationship between the effect and the cause, which makes causes pointless, because you can have effects from anything. So to say that cause and effect are either identical or distinct is sort of completely undermine either one in the first place. And the commentary points out how this is structurally equivalent to the same form of negation that the Buddha applies to the relationship between the reaper and the sower of karma. So Buddha deploys this operation to point out how the Yeah, so the Buddha uses this argument against the reaper and sower of karma, and Nāgārjuna uses it against the cause and effect of existing things. And something I wanted to point out, something I picked up from studying Peter Paul Kakel's book, Emptiness and Becoming, where he sort of contrasts Madhyamaka with Whiteheadian process philosophy. Actually sort of Whitehead and Hartshorne, but anyway, this idea of this operation of by negation, which I think he also borrows from another contemporary Madhyamaka scholar, who I forget exactly. But by negation is basically this form of negation, which takes two necessary possible relations between 2 things, and eliminating it in order to show that the things in question are merely hypostatized. Because they are hypostatized, we're able to consider them in the first place, but because they're hypostatized, we also can't posit them as being identical or distinct because there's nothing there to be posited as identical or distinct. And I think I'm only saying this because it's something I had to elaborate for myself. But by negation sounds like double negation, but it's distinct because whereas the procedure of double negation elimination basically results in something positive from this sort of repeated negation of something else. It's sort of by negation is different because it consists of negating two different things that we're considering, two meaningfully different things, whereas double negation elimination sort of just establishes a positive term by means of the twice negating of itself. I'm not speaking logically, but just something I have to point out. Oh, and another interesting thing here is that the by negation operation almost necessarily requires us to abide by the law of the excluded middle. Again, sort of referring back to a point I made previously, is that if we didn't abide by the law of the excluded middle and admitted a third possibility, then the force of the argument diminishes dramatically, because the force of the argument comes from the fact that it refutes the only possible ways of conceiving this relationship. What was that? That was verse 10. Yes, anything else to say here? Yeah, so referring to the Buddha's use of the by negation, the commentary says that the Buddhist strategy of the middle path shows that the person is neither subject to annihilation nor eternal, by showing that because the sower and reaper can be neither identical nor distinct, these can only represent hypothetizations of the elements of a causal series. Whether or not you're thinking about cause and effect or reaper and sower, the sort of operation of by negation leads you to the same result, which is the thing that you're analyzing is hypostatized and cannot hold the two logical positions that the by negation refutes. So verse 11, not having a single goal, not having many goals, not destroyed, not eternal. This is the nectar of the teachings of the Buddhas, lords of the world. And I think I see another by negation here, right? So except, by negation is not necessarily tied to just neither identical nor distinct. I think it can also be tied to neither one nor many. And so here there's neither one nor many goals, precisely because the very idea of a goal depends on things existing. But if things are empty, then there's no goal to have, or there's no goal to strive towards, whether it's a single goal or multiple goals. And because of this also shows that there's no basis to posit the Buddha's teachings as either being eternal or ever destroyed, that the Dharma is never destroyed or even arisen. And so even the Buddha Dharma is empty. And so this is considered to be the nectar of the teachings of the Buddhas. And verse 12 seems to be an elaboration a little bit on this idea that the Buddha Dharma is neither destroyed or eternal, where verse 12 says, though the completely enlightened ones do not arise and the Shravakas disappear, the knowledge of the Pratyeka Buddhas arises independently. And as part of the commentary sort of points out, the reason why you bring this up about the sort of two modes of awakening is that the Pratyeka Buddha kind of shows as a good example of how the Buddhist teaching is never destroyed or eternal, because of the fact that someone can relatively independently, realize the Dharma without the existence of a previous Buddha teaching them or giving a line of transmission to them. And this goes to the point that the Buddha Dharma never is destroyed because someone can independently realize it. And for the same reason, it's not eternal. Because if it were eternal, then there would be no one to independently realize it, right? If it were eternal, then it'll always be there. So the whole idea of, you know, a Pratyeka Buddha wouldn't make sense. So a Pratyeka Buddha makes sense precisely because the Buddha Dharma is neither eternally present nor ever subject to cessation. Yeah, and so that's the chapter on the self. Do we have any more concluding remarks, or are we done?
Just really fast, going back to verse 9, because I've been thinking about this for.
No, okay.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one. Okay.
So Ganeri actually translates that, again, going back to our idea of not prapanchad by prapancha, as not conceptualized by conception, is how Ganeri reads prapanchaya aprapanchita, which I think is interesting, to say not conceptualized by conception.
Is this in Ganeri's philosophy of classical India?
Yeah.
Okay, because it's the only place that I could think of that he translates Nāgārjuna.
Yeah.
Oh, is that just like a survey of thinking of thoughts by like Madhyamikas or Nāgārjuna? Because interesting
I think
that particular verse gets isolated.
Nāgārjuna, I think, is the only one. It's like the only Madhyamaka, sorry, in that anthology. It's 6 thinkers. It's like Gautama of the Nyaya Sutra. It's Nāgārjuna. It's, I think, he has Gangesha in it, and 3 others that I'm forgetting at the moment. But Vaisheshika, I think, like Vaisheshika Sutra of Kannada, I believe.
Interesting.
You might have Sri Harsha in that, because I know he's also interested in Sri Harsha.
And then other people not proliferated by proliferations. So that fits what they said, not populated by hypostatization. So there it's viewing the aprapanchatam as using prapancha in the sense of proliferated or populated, and then the prapanchaya, the prapanchaihi prapancha as hypostatization.
Interesting. So
Yeah,
I think
the double meaning throws you off. It's like, but you don't even have to read with the double meaning. You can read like not hypostatized by hypostatization. That is also a way to like, you know, do it. It just gets, I don't know, kind of throws you off by.
I won't be able to like articulate this super well, but I just want to point out that there's something I've picked up, particularly from Dan Arnold, that, and you know, just my understanding of sort of the relationship between the two truths. It seems like, in a weird way, hypostatization kind of presupposes itself. There's something about conventional existence that sort of are produced by a kind of assumption of their already existing. There's something circular about the way that conventional existence are posited. And so it makes sense to see how, you know, hypostatization kind of already presupposes itself. And through that, hypostatization happens. I don't know if that elucidates anything. But before we go, and I think it is sort of tangentially related. So last night I was sort of just like working on this sort of exercise that I was thinking of, and it might be. Oh my gosh. Okay. Is that backwards? Okay, you won't be able to read it, but you can see
It's
it.
not backwards.
Okay, so you won't be able to see it, but basically I was thinking, okay, like, you know how satya means like both truth and reality, or it can be translated as either way. And sometimes I found that confusing. And then I also wonder, like, is it because I'm confused, or is there something kind of being equivocated maybe in that term? So I was thinking like, okay, like what if we divide reality and truth? So the satya into those two components. And then there's a subdivision. Okay, before I talk about that. So then here I'm also thinking, okay, what about all the different ways of considering subject and object, right? So you can think of them as absolutely different, as relatively codependent, as non-dual, and the final phase is completely unarisen from the very beginning. And with each of these different orientations, sort of, okay, subdividing that into, so the top level would be like, so conventional truth and conventional reality, and then ultimate truth and ultimate reality. And the way I have it here is that for every single level, conventional reality is exactly the same. And conventional truth, the epistemic resources that gives knowledge of conventional reality, is also exactly the same. But what's different is that the way that each phase, let's say, conceptualizes ultimate reality and ultimate truth. So with the view that subject and object are absolutely different, I kind of have this idea that ultimate reality consists of irreducible point particulars that are the unconditioned conditions of experience. And I think that kind of sort of correlates a little bit to like the sort of Vaibhashika and Sautrantika view of things, maybe the Abhidharma view. And that ultimate truth consists of a kind of like procedure of reductive analysis of wholes into their parts, right? To come to the sort of ultimate reality of irreducible point particulars. But let's say in the next phase, with the relative view, the view that subject and object are relative, the ultimate truth is sort of acquired through the procedure of more kind of a dialectical analysis than a reductive one that shows that all the constituents of analysis are all mutually implicated. So this means that ultimate reality is the suggestion is now that ultimate reality is a kind of relational matrix of processes that are relative processes rather than irreducible point particulars. And the interesting thing is that with this next phase, it actually includes the preceding phase's ultimate reality as its own conventional reality. So from the point of view that ultimate reality is a relative matrix of processes, from that perspective, the idea that ultimate reality is irreducible point particulars is just a conventional view, right? So each new phase turns the last phase's ultimate reality into just conventional reality. So then the non-dual phase is like, okay, it's not even just that, subject and object are co-relative, but that they're actually indivisible aspects of the same process, right? So it's non-dual. And I think this actually can be considered some Madhyamaka views. And so ultimate truth is proceeded through a dialectical analysis of the unfindability or dialectical analytic unfindability of any conventional reality. And because of the unfindability of conventional reality, what this results in is that ultimate reality is kind of this inexplicable unity of conventional reality and ultimate truth, that there are appearances, yet they are empty and unfindable. And for a long time, I was sort of stuck on this non-dual position. But especially reading the MMK with you guys, I realized there might be another phase, very different from the others actually, which I call unarising, which is that subject and object are not even just non-dual. They don't arise in the first place to even be considered non-dually. And the interesting thing for this is that this seems to be a kind of complete absence of conceptualization here. So we can understand the previous three phases as having ultimate truth procedures being conceptually mediated, right? Which results in a kind of subtly conceptually mediated idea of ultimate reality. Whereas from the phase of unarising, you don't do any kind of analysis, whether reductive, dialectical, or probative to find something. Instead, it's the sort of direct awareness of conventional reality as merely conventional reality. And that what that actually results is that ultimate reality is nothing but conventional reality, seen as merely conventional.
So it's a good way of understanding graded teachings, I think.
Yeah, and I think this ends up corresponding to some of the graded teachings, but I guess my point here is to show that from the scheme I'm articulating here, from the phase of unarising, it actually seems like ultimate reality is conventional reality seen as merely conventional, which means that the ultimate reality has an element of hypothesization on it. but it does not have more than that. It does not have more than the initial moment that created conventional reality. So you see conventional reality as it is, as merely hypothesized, and that's the ultimate reality, which is not something that can be found. So it actually includes all the insights of the previous phases, but it's radically distinct in the sense that I think only the unarising phase is truly non-conceptual, because everything else is sort of mediated by some kind of analysis, right? Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I was just continuously belaboring the point that I sort of thought of reading this chapter. And also sort of based on just some precursor thinking about, whether or not Buddha is ignorant. Yeah, it seems like, abiding in the unarisen nature of things is to see the conventional as unarisen, and it's not to see something else distinct from conventional reality, like some kind of, non-dual undefiled consciousness or something, which is what I relegate to the non-dual phase, right? That's what it abides by. But yeah, I don't know. There's that. I just want to mention excitedly about this little mini project that I was conceiving of.
So I do have to run.
Yeah, I think we're done.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for sticking
This is
so
great.
long.
We went an hour over, but I had a really good time. This was great.
No, this is great, and I'm glad because this is actually like a very, I think it was a really fruitful chapter. It's a lot of things to think about, and I haven't seen you guys in like a while, so it was great to
this is great. We're
chit-chat a
catching
little
up on lost time.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So if we want, hopefully we can do it next weekend. And I think, let's see. So there's analysis of
let's
time.
read the rest of the book. No.
I do want to be finished so bad. Like this is like a year already. Like I want to go through with it with you guys because it's very insightful. But I just can't wait to finish it. But anyway, analysis of time, that's super short. It's like 5 pages. And then analysis of the assemblage, and that's like 14 pages. So you think we can do 19 and 20? Because I think 19 would just be too short for a single session. So yeah, let's hope to get to 19 and 20 for next session, time and assemblage. And then it seems like from that, we might be able to finish up in 3 to 4 more sessions, which probably means 3 or 4 more months, but however long that takes. All right, so thank you guys again, and hopefully see you next week or whenever that will be.
See you next meeting. Bye.
Bye, everyone.